In Rome, Michelangelo made preparations for the Pope's tomb, a giant mausoleum that was to be completed within a 5-year timeline. Having traveled to the famous quarries at Carrara, he spent some 6 months painstakingly searching out the perfect blocks of marble from which to conjure his figures. Much to his chagrin, Julius recalled Michelangelo to Rome, where he learned that the building earmarked to house the tomb was to be pulled down and the project as a whole put on ice. Michelangelo was incensed and became convinced that there was a conspiracy to destroy him. Indeed, he believed that the architect of the new St. Peter's Basilica, Bramante, was hatching a plot to have him poisoned. In his anger, Michelangelo returned to Florence and wrote a letter to the Pope expressing disgust at his treatment in Rome. Michelangelo found himself at the center of a tricky diplomatic standoff between Florence and Rome. As Gombrich writes, the head of the city of Florence therefore persuaded Michelangelo to return to the services of Julius II and gave him a letter of recommendation in which he said that his art was unequaled throughout Italy, perhaps even throughout the world, and that if he met with kindness, he would achieve things that which would amaze the whole world. Having produced a colossal bronze statue of the Pope for the newly conquered city of Bologna, unceremoniously pulled down once papal occupiers had been repelled, Michelangelo was commissioned by Julius to complete a project already started by Botticelli, Ghirlandaio, and others. The commission was to paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, and legend has it that Bramante had convinced the Pope that Michelangelo was the best man for the job, in the knowledge that Michelangelo was better known for his sculptures and was therefore almost certain to fail in this enormous undertaking. Michelangelo would work on the Sistine Chapel for nearly 4 years. It was a job of extraordinary endurance in which, according to popular mythology, the artist painted the ceiling laying on his back atop a wooden scaffold structure, a task made even more difficult given that the tempestuous artist had dismissed all of his assistants, save one who helped him mix paint. What resulted, however, was a monumental work of stunning virtuosity illustrating stories from the Old Testament, including the creation of the world and Noah and the flood. The finished work, which featured several nude figures, a fairly uncommon feature of the time, would become a towering masterpiece of human creation. Sistine Chapel Sailing, painted between 1508 and 1512, Michelangelo work on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, the large papal chapel built within the Vatican by Pope Sixtus IV, remains a cornerstone work of high Renaissance art. The ceiling's various painted elements form part of a larger scheme of decoration within the chapel, which includes Michelangelo, later wall fresco, The Last Judgment, as well as other wall paintings by leading 15th century artists, including Sandro Botticelli, Domenico Ghirlandaio, and Pietro Perugino. The chapel also features a set of large tapestries by Raphael, illustrating the doctrine of the Catholic Church. Central to Michelangelo's celebrated ceiling decoration are 9 scenes from the Book of Genesis, of which the creation of Adam is the best known, an image that has achieved an iconic status only equaled by Leonardo da Vinci's Mona Lisa, where the hands of God and Adam are represented at the point of man's creation. The complex design includes several sets of individual figures, both clothed and nude, allowing Michelangelo to fully demonstrate his skill in creating a huge variety of poses for the human figure, destined to influence countless artists for the following centuries. In 1506, Pope Julius II designed a program to paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, where the walls of the chapel had already been decorated 20 years earlier. The lowest of 3 levels was painted to resemble draped hangings, which was hung on special occasions with the set of tapestries designed by Raphael. The middle level contains a complex scheme of frescoes illustrating the life of Christ on the right side and the life of Moses on the left side. It was carried out by some of the most renowned Renaissance painters: Botticelli, Ghirlandaio, Perugino, Pinturicchio, Signorelli, and Cosimo Rosselli. The upper level of the walls contains the windows, between which are painted pairs of illusionistic niches with representations of the first 32 popes. A draft by Matteo d'Amelia indicates that the ceiling was painted blue and decorated with gold stars, representing the zodiacal constellations. Michelangelo, who was primarily known as a sculptor and not a painter, was reluctant to take on the project. At the time of the ambitious assignment, he was occupied with a very large sculptural commission for the Pope's tomb. Nevertheless, the Pope was adamant, leaving Michelangelo no choice but to accept. Nevertheless, a war with the French broke out, diverting the attention of the Pope, and Michelangelo fled Rome to continue working on his sculpting. The tomb sculptures, however, were never to be finished, as in 1508 the Pope returned to Rome victorious and summoned Michelangelo to return and commence work on the ceiling. The contract was signed on 10th of May 1508. The scheme proposed by the Pope was for 12 large figures of the apostles to occupy the pendentives. Michelangelo negotiated for a grander and more complex scheme, and he was eventually permitted to do as he wished with the ceiling. His scheme for the work ultimately comprised some 300 figures and took 4 years to execute, being completed in 1512. To reach the chapel's ceiling, Michelangelo designed his own scaffold, a flat wooden platform on brackets built out from holes in the wall near the top of the windows, rather than being built up from the floor. It has been speculated that this was in order to cut the cost of timber. According to Michelangelo pupil and biographer Ascanio Condivi, the brackets and frame that supported the steps and flooring were all put in place at the beginning of the work, and a lightweight screen, possibly cloth, was suspended beneath them to catch plaster drips, dust, and excess paint drips. Only half of the building was framed with scaffolding at a time, and the platform was moved as the painting was completed in stages. The areas of the wall covered by the scaffolding still appear as unpainted areas across the bottom of the lunettes. Interestingly, the same holes were used again to hold scaffolding in the recent restoration. Contrary to popular belief, the artist painted in a standing position, not lying on his back as has been passed down into legend. According to Vasari, the work was carried out in extremely uncomfortable conditions, from his having to work with his head tilted upwards. The fresco painting technique involved applying the paint to damp plaster, which Michelangelo had learnt whilst apprenticed in the workshop of Domenico Ghirlandaio, one of the most competent practitioners of this art form at the time. Michelangelo was also almost certainly influenced by the paintings of Luca Signorelli, particularly his works in the Death and Resurrection cycle in Orvieto Cathedral, which feature many nudes and inventive figurative compositions. When first beginning the Sistine ceiling project, the plaster, intonaco, began to grow mold due to being too wet. Therefore, Michelangelo had to remove his initial attempts and start all over again. This time, he tried a new formula created by one of his assistants, Jacopo Lindaco, which involved resisting mold, heralding a new Italian building tradition. As the artist was painting fresco, the plaster was laid in a new section every day, called a giornata. At the beginning of each session, the edges would be scraped away and a new area laid down. The edges between giornate remained somewhat visible, giving a glimpse of how the work would finally appear as they progressed. It was customary for fresco painters to use a full-sized cartoon to transfer a design onto a plaster surface. However, Michelangelo broke from tradition. Confident the intonaco had been well applied, he drew directly onto the ceiling. His energetic sweeping outlines can be seen scraped onto some of the surfaces, while on others a grid is evident, indicating that he enlarged directly onto the ceiling from a small drawing. Michelangelo painted on the damp plaster using a wash technique to apply broad areas of color. Then, as the surface became drier, he revisited these areas with a more linear approach, adding shade and detail with a variety of brushes. For some textured surfaces, such as facial hair and wood grain, he opted for a broad brush with bristles as sparse as a comb. He employed all the finest workshop methods and innovations, combining them with a range of brushwork techniques, exceeding the skills of his previous fresco master Ghirlandaio. The work commenced at the end of the building furthest from the altar, with the latest of the narrative scenes, and progressed towards the altar with the scenes of the creation. The first three scenes from the story of Noah contain a much larger number of small figures than the later panels. This is partly because of the subject matter, which deals with the fate of humanity, but also because all the figures at that end of the ceiling, including the prophets and ignudi, are smaller than in the central section. The ignudi are 20 athletic nude males that Michelangelo painted as supporting figures at each corner of the 5 smaller narrative scenes, which run along the center of the ceiling. The lean figures are represented as being decorated with a variety of items, including pink ribbons, green bolsters, and large garlands of acorns. As the scale of the work grew larger, Michelangelo's style became broader, with the final narrative scene of God in the act of creation being reportedly painted in a single day. The continual subject matter of the ceiling is the doctrine of humanity's need for salvation as offered by God through Jesus. It is a visual metaphor of humankind's need for a covenant with God. The old covenant of the children of Israel through Moses and the new covenant through Christ had already been represented around the walls of the chapel. The main components of the design are 9 scenes from the book of Genesis, concerning the downfall of Adam and Eve and their expulsion from the Garden of Eden. These are formed of 5 smaller scenes, each framed and supported by 4 naked youths or ignudi. At either end and beneath the scenes are the figures of 12 men and women that prophesied the birth of Christ. On the crescent-shaped areas, or lunettes, above each of the chapel's windows are tablets listing the ancestors of Christ and accompanying figures. Above them, in the triangular spandrels, a further 8 groups of figures are depicted, though these have not been identified with specific biblical characters. The narrative elements of the ceiling illustrate how God made the world as a perfect creation, placing humanity into the center. The ceiling then portrays how humanity fell into disgrace and was punished by death and separation from God. Humanity then sank further into sin and disgrace, finally to be punished by the great flood. Through a lineage of ancestors from Abraham to Joseph, God sends the Savior of humanity, Jesus Christ. The coming of the Savior was prophesied by the prophets of Israel and sibyls of the classical world. The various components of the ceiling are linked to this Christian doctrine. Traditionally, the Old Testament was perceived as a prefiguring of the New Testament. Many incidents and characters of the Old Testament were commonly understood as having a direct symbolic link to a particular aspect of the life of Jesus, or to an important element of Christian doctrine, or to a sacrament, such as baptism or the Eucharist. The scenes from the altar towards the main door are ordered as follows: the separation of light and darkness, the creation of the sun, moon, and earth, the separation of land and water, the creation of Adam, the creation of Eve, the temptation and expulsion, the sacrifice of Noah, the great flood, the drunkenness of Noah. The medallions represent Abraham about to sacrifice his son Isaac, the destruction of the statue of Baal, the worshippers of Baal being brutally slaughtered, Uriah being beaten to death, Nathan the priest condemning King David for murder and adultery, King David's traitorous son Absalom caught by his hair in a tree while trying to escape and beheaded by David's troops, Joab sneaking up on Abner to murder him, Joram being hurled from a chariot onto his head, Elijah being carried up to heaven. On one medallion, the subject is either obliterated or incomplete. On October 1984, the Vatican commenced a historic first stage of restoration on the Sistine Chapel's lunettes, which then proceeded onto the ceiling paintings and was completed by December 1989. Restoration work then started on the Last Judgment. The whole restoration was unveiled by Pope John Paul II on 8th of April 1994. The colors, which now appear vibrantly fresh with pale pinks, apple greens, vivid yellows and sky blues against a background of warm pearly grey, had become greatly discolored by candle smoke over the years, almost rendering the appearance of the works as monochrome. The restoration has removed the filter of grime to reveal the original colors that Michelangelo had originally intended. Nevertheless, the restoration was met with both praise and criticism. Critics assert that much original work by Michelangelo, in particular pentimenti, highlights, and shadows, were lost in the removal of various accretions. The ceiling of the Sistine Chapel was to have a profound effect upon other artists, even before the great work was completed. Vasari, in his Life of Raphael, records that Bramante, who had the keys to the chapel, let Raphael in to examine the paintings in Michelangelo's absence. On seeing Michelangelo prophets, Raphael went back to the picture of the prophet Isaiah he was painting on a column in the church of Sant'Agostino and, although it was finished, scraped it off the wall and repainted it in a much more powerful manner, in imitation of Michelangelo work. "500 years ago," Vasari wrote, "the whole world came running when the vault was revealed, and the sight of it was enough to reduce them to stunned silence." In January 2007, it was estimated that as many as 10,000 visitors passed through the Vatican museums on an average day, and that the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel is, of course, the main attraction. The Vatican, anxious that the newly restored frescoes would suffer damage, announced plans to reduce visiting hours and raise the price in an attempt to discourage visitors. There are few design elements on the Sistine ceiling that have not been subsequently imitated by a leading artist, including the fictional depiction of architecture, the muscular anatomy, the masterful foreshortening, the luminous coloration, and the mysterious putti and ignudi. Among the artists in whose work can be seen the direct influence of Michelangelo are Pontormo, Andrea del Sarto, Correggio, Tintoretto, Annibale Carracci, Paolo Veronese, and El Greco, to name only a few examples. For Michelangelo's own work, the chapel ceiling led to his Mannerist painting of the Last Judgment. The crowded composition of this later wall fresco allowed the artist to develop his inventiveness further with contorted and foreshortened figures, expressing the dual polarities of despair and jubilation.